Ilana Razbash, and this is Radio Architecture.
Good evening from beautiful Bunurong country. We are broadcasting to you live from the Karam Karam Swamp on unceded Eastern Kulin Nation land. As always, if you'd like to join the conversation, please text us in the studio on 0493 213 831. We'd love to have you with us. My guest and conversation partner this evening is Dr Kirsten Day. She is a senior lecturer in architecture, technology and practice at the University of Melbourne and a principal at Norman Day and Associates. Her research examines the contingent nature of architectural practice, how the profession adapts to and is shaped by broader systems, including legislative changes, procurement methods, digital transitions, and the legacy of architectural professionalism. She is especially interested in how these systems define, restrict, or expand the role of the architect. Dr. Day's work also explores the limitations of inclusion in architectural design, investigating how standards, codes, and guidelines intend to promote equity can still exclude individuals with disabilities or those who experience space in a neurodivergent way. Her recent publication, including the co-authored book, The Organiser's Guide to Architectural Education, Routledge 2024, which provides practical strategies for aligning architectural curricula with issues of labour equity, digital change, and professional evolution. She is also the co-editor of Global Dimensions in Housing 2018, From Conflict to Inclusion in Housing 2017, and Housing Solutions Through Design 2017. Welcome to the program, Kirsten.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so glad to have you on. Such an important, interesting, timely conversation. I think the Institute of Architects has just released their federal election priorities, and so many of the themes that are your work and your research and subject interest are coming up. So such an amazing time for this conversation.
Fantastic. Yes.
Before we dive into that,
Okay.
I'm going to ask the first question I love to ask all my guests. And that's, what's your earliest memory of a building or place?
Oh, it would be my grandparents' house in Reservoir. And my, it was just sort of one of those sort of standard 1920s, 1930s houses, nothing spectacular about it. There was the toilet out in the garden. But someone had been travelling and there were these black velvet cushions that were on the couch that it was almost like a sort of a glittery type of thing. And I think they were either of Fiji or Japan or something, but they just seemed so exotic. And it was just like, ooh, places to travel to, things that sort of were really sort of different and unusual to they just sort of stuck in my memory. So, like Mount Fuji, but as a kid, like as a really small kid, just going, wow, it's a volcano.
It's so incredible.
So, yeah, it probably wasn't so much the house itself, but it was, sort of the finishes, the feel of the inside. I remember sort of the light coming through the window and you could see dust and things like that. So,
and you did end up travelling to those exotic places in Asia.
I did. And although I really think that had probably a lot more to do when I was a bit older and watching Monkey on the ABC and just going, yeah, China, why not?
So why architecture?
That's a really, really good question. I've got friends who, wanted to be an architect since they were 3. I didn't decide halfway through year 12 because I always thought you needed lots of maths and stuff to do architecture. I had wanted to do fashion design, but my mum was like, you'll never get a job. She wanted me to be a podiatrist. Halfway through I just went, right, I'll put in as architect. I'd never met an architect. I had no idea really what architects did. And I was lucky I got into RMIT on my first round offer, but even I probably spent my first 2 years of architecture just going, what what am I doing?
Until the aha moment happens.
Yeah, and then I went overseas, and then the aha moment happened. So, yeah.
How did that unfold? I'm curious. What was it for you? What was the...
I was really fortunate, and I think this is something where probably throughout my career, I've met some really amazing people who have. There's been opportunities there, and I've been able to take them. I had a really good friend who had graduated from RMIT and had got me a job at the Ministry of Housing when that existed. And so in my summers, I watched people outside doing things that I really wanted to do. And I was learning how to trace drawings because this was well before computers. And and after that, so I had a couple of years, and then we had, it wasn't the global financial crisis, but it was one of the ones beforehand. And a lot of people had then gone off to places like Bangkok or Hong Kong to get work. And so my friend Paul had come back and had got married, and I rocked up to his reception in shorts and a T-shirt and some guy. And he said, oh, we're looking for a student to come and look after the library and just do studenty stuff. And I looked at this guy and went, yeah, okay, see you later. And then 2 months later I was living in Hong Kong. And it was great because it was an opportunity where, I was doing sort of stuff that students do in an office, but I was looking after their library and just sort of seeing, IMPay's Bank of China or the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, and sort of like my first sort of Starchitect moment, and then going and opening my HSB bank account in the Norman Foster building because it was like, oh my God. And then, I was there for a while and came back and then decided, this is what I really want to do. And it was just like a complete change in attitude in terms of how I was studying and actually taking things quite seriously. But also I think there was a confidence, probably being a bit older, but also just a confidence of being out in the world. And
do you think it was a maturity that came from travel, or there was a particular lesson that...
I think it was probably both. I think there is a maturity in travel and, not being at home anymore and then having to survive in a country where I don't speak the language, I don't look like anybody. I couldn't buy shoes there because my feet were too big. And of course I'd had my luggage stolen on the first night. So it was sort of an interesting thing of just buying men's clothes and sort of living in those for the first 6 months. But it was just, I think I met some really, really great friends and spent way too much time at disco. And it was, it was just that, travel, but also finding familiarity in a place that was, completely foreign. Although, at that stage it was still a British colony and all of that type of stuff. But there was something really nice about being an alien and knowing not only that wasn't that I didn't fit in, but that I was never going to fit in. It was, I don't know, I don't even know how to explain that one. So
there's a certain permission perhaps that came with being different.
Yeah, I think so. So it was, and then came back, finished my degree. There was always that opportunity of probably not going back. But
I just want to ask, what was the city like? What was Hong Kong like at the time?
Oh, it was amazing. It was
early 90s, right?
Yeah, early 90s. And so it was one of those places where I had a really love-hate relationship. It was so energizing and there was so many people around and it was smelly, and there were like to get to work I would walk through the snake market and sometimes I'd escape, and there was there was a level of, it wasn't a griminess, there was a grittiness to it that was very different to the suburb that I grew up in. And but then, the next day it would be like, oh, there's too many people. Oh, it's so oppressive. I don't fit in. But then, it's I don't have to fit in, and I don't have to sort of try and make myself fit in. So it was very much this really interesting dynamic. But it was interesting coming back to Australia and then just going, it's so small, and where are all the people? And there wasn't that, things were open late and things were always open. It was just a very, it was a very urban experience. And since then, I've sort of craved that urban experience, living in an apartment, living sort of close to people, enjoying sort of the grittiness of the city, I guess.
Where was your first job and practice in Australia?
After finishing? That's a good question. I think one of my first jobs outside of graduate... Oh, I know. When you sort of...
Repressive memory.
I went to Sydney and I was there for a couple of months, and I was working at Henry Pollock and Associates, who were the architects for Mirvac, and we were working on the Port Melbourne development. And I didn't last very long. I didn't really want to last very long. I met my partner when he was still in Melbourne, and it was just sort of like, I just really don't want to be here. And Sydney had big spiders, and it was the first time there were cockroaches in Hong Kong, but the cockroaches in Sydney were just completely different. So
the cockroaches in Sydney were scarier than the snake market in Hong Kong.
That is true.
Wow, Sydney, what's going on?
I don't know. It was sort of I came back to Melbourne, and then just had a whole lot of, I guess probably like a lot of recent graduates, you have a whole lot of sort of, it's not sort of couch surfing, but sort of the sample jobs until you find one that you really enjoyed. And for a while there, I worked at a drafting firm, and it was great. I loved getting up in the morning and going to work. And I was there for about 18 months, but then it wasn't me, it was someone else who started sleeping with the boss, and it all sort of went red. I just went, I'm going and doing something else now. But again, made some friends. So
what did moving cities and even moving countries for work and in pursuit of kind of your place in architecture and your place in the profession teach you?
I guess, because I lived in Hong Kong, but we also did RMIT's campus in Vietnam, and as part of that, we opened an office there. And I think having lived in Hong Kong, I had no sort of problems with going and living in a country where I don't speak the language, I don't fit in, I don't look like anybody, and I actually don't mind that at all.
Do you think that resistance made you more creative?
Possibly. Maybe creative. Maybe sort of now, and I suppose there is a creativity in research where it's, I'm not particularly worried by boundaries. Like when I was doing my PhD and I was looking at comparisons between architecture in Hong Kong and architecture in Shanghai, and how, like in Hong Kong, feng shui is sort of an accepted thing, but in mainland China, it's a feudal superstition. It's not a thing, and but it was like, I know a little bit of Chinese, I'll be right, fine. But I guess it was just sort of, and maybe it's also the training as an architect. It's like, okay, there's a problem to solve, or there's a thing to do, and so you move forward with what tools you have, and you sort of resolve things along the way.
It's the I'll figure it out mindset.
Yeah, very much.
When did that passion for research come up for you?
I don't know. I think it's always been there. I'm not too sure it was very evident to any of my teachers in high school, but Yeah, I've always read a lot. Probably not what they want me to read while I was at school, but yeah, I have forever buying books, and I think I started doing my masters at RMIT, and that sort of became an interesting adventure, and I ended up at Swinburne, and I think it's maybe it's more of a problem solving thing, which I think is actually quite an architectural trait.
It really is, yeah.
Yeah, so I just think it was that, and because in practice, I enjoyed the detailing of things. Give me a space and I'm there and I'm sort of adding bits to it. So I think that detail orientation really sort of led me down that research path. But I started teaching as a sessional at RMIT when I got back from Vietnam, and just really enjoyed it. And then that was the end. The downfall started, and I fell into the darker side. So.
No doubt your students hugely value and appreciate you, though, for changing over to that dark side or taking up a bigger seat there. I wonder what do you feel is your biggest lesson that you're able to impart on the students?
Oh, I guess it's probably, I hope, respect for the profession. It isn't something that I believe is particularly stable. I mean, there's a design skill, sure, but I think the profession can easily be, maybe it's more to do with architectural practice and looking at recent changes, particularly when we've had the Shergold-Weir report, that confidence in the construction industry, that architects don't have that level of power that we used to have, having project managers who've come in and taken a fair bit of what we've done, but we've also allowed that to happen. And I find it quite concerning that people just think, the Institute should look after this, or another of our peak body organisations, where it really should be something that you become involved and you do organise, and that you participate. And if you don't participate, then you have no right to sort of complain about it.
That's that extra large scale that the book talks about.
Yeah.
And advocating up to government.
Yes, absolutely.
And communicating the value of good design.
Yeah.
What's one thing you really wish the public knew?
I think it's probably the value of architects, because I think we're really terrible about talking about our value.
That's about to be my next question. Because everyone has their own way of expressing that. How do you communicate the value of architecture and good design and architectural services? What does that really as an idea mean to you?
I think it's probably, in a weird way, it's probably where we don't really notice the design. It's where we don't have issues with a space. We're not sort of worried about wayfinding. We're not worried about glare. We're not worried about how we get into a building, It works. It works, yeah, but it works in a way where it doesn't. I'm just sort of trying to find the words for it. There's a whole lot of words in the book. It's almost it becomes unnoticed because it is so well and it's so well done. And I think a lot of the work that we've done, particularly looking around disability, where we see people with lived experiences almost like the expert user group, because if they can use an environment, then it's a fabulous thing for everybody else.
Yes. It universalizes it instantly, right? If children and the elderly are safe in the streets of your city, can get around as a very famous example, then everyone is safe and your city works wonderfully.
Yeah, and things like, I've gone around the city with a colleague of mine, Peter Razbash, who is now in a wheelchair, and just watching him navigate some of those curb cuts and just that precarious nature of, is the chair going to tip as you move on the bike? It's the person with the pram. It's the person with the doing deliveries. It's and I find it really interesting where there becomes so much resistance to a lot of the guidelines, particularly around access, and it's just like, well, it's because they're like, oh, it's only a small percentage of people, but it's like, well, actually, it's everybody.
And the biggest benefactors of accessibility and accessible adaptions are able-bodied people.
Exactly.
They receive the greatest benefit from it.
Yeah. There was a whole lot of work I've done on neurodiversity, and we've run a number of neurodiversity design studios with a colleague of mine, Andrew Martell. And with that, it's, we're looking at people with autism and, how they might experience space. But if you've got a space where people are really comfortable, the lights aren't flickering, the lights are all sort of the same colour, there's an ability to customise a space, whether it's, you can alter things where you can open a window or close a window, turn the temperature down or turn the air movement down. All of those things become, just make environments better for everybody.
It's about choice, isn't it?
It is.
Sometimes I really just break apart all those difficult concepts around accessibility and universal design, and you can really just synthesize and bring it down to that core idea of choice. It's giving people choice and flexibility in their environment.
Yep.
That's a good one. that gives me pause. What are some of the findings in the research and in writing this book that you feel is at the moment particularly urgent in our present cultural moment, and as we're moving towards the election with some of these priorities being put forward by the Institute of Architects?
Right. Okay. So I guess the book is an interesting one because it really is about how do we make effective change. And so I've been involved with the architecture lobby for a number of years, and I'm now on their board of the architecture lobby.
You must tell us about the architecture lobby for listeners. They're based in the United States, aren't they?
Yeah, so they're based in the United States. It was founded by Peggy Deemer, who's one of our co-authors, and she's written a lot about architecture as labour, and I think that's a particularly important thing because often architects think of ourselves as artists, and so we don't think about what we do as a business. We don't necessarily think of what we do as workers, and in that if we're not able to communicate, and I guess it goes back to that idea about value. It is really just thinking about we provide a service for people, and in many cases we get paid for that, and so that has to be done in a professional manner. Or even if we're doing things that are pro bono, and we've done a lot of that type of work in our practice, it still has to be done in a particular way. With the book, and particularly with with the lobby, we were part of an academic working group, and in 1921. What century am I in? 2021, we started a series of summer schools, and they were called the Architecture Beyond Capitalism Summer Schools. And the idea with this was all of the things that we couldn't learn in architecture schools. So we can only fit so much into a degree, and we've got a whole lot of accreditation bodies that are saying you have to fit more things into a degree. And if we're talking about the planet more broadly, we have people who were talking about designing things that were sort of waste. We had there was a fantastic book by Matthew Sewell's Iceberg Zombies and the Super Thin, Architecture and Capitalism in the 21st Century. And geologist or social, I can't remember exactly what her title is. Saskia Sasson writes a lot about the city. And I remember going to see her at the Living Cities Forum, and she was talking about architecture as an asset. And I just sort of came out of there mind blown, just going, everything I learnt was wrong. Everything was a lie. Because we're designing, and I guess this is, if we're thinking about designing for, different abilities and you know, what's the human experience of space? But if it's all just about money, well then, what have I done with my degree? It was sort of one of those, oh no moments, and so I mean, so those were really fabulous, and so we had all these different speakers, and then there were a whole lot of people internationally. So, and I guess with the book itself, it's probably a little bit preaching to the choir. But yeah, that sort of, it came out of a series of those. We were looking at the design studio and just a whole range of different topics, and
I find that shift in perspective super interesting, and scales where you're going from the small and the little small things that you can do to affect change through to the really big actions.
Yeah, and I think that's. Yeah, starting at small, and we're looking at the design studio, but to establish a design studio, whether you're doing something to do with disability or whether you're doing something about sustainability or whatever it is, then as you sort of move to the next scale, well, how do I deal with faculty, and how do I convince them of the value of running this? And then they will have their set of metrics that they need to include, and then there's the university, and then there's all these other scales. And so if we're trying to sort of impact change as architects, it becomes not just understanding what I can do, you know, with my little book in the design studio, but how do all of these things that sort of create systems around me and that I'm sort of contingent to, it was a really quite fascinating exercise to go through and have a look at. Well, at a global scale, we've got the Bologna system that means that it's easy for people for trade and education, so that people can transfer across different universities across the world, and that also means that we now have a 3-year degree plus a 2-year degree, which means that what happens in the 3-year degree is kind of important, but it's what happens in those 2 years. But then there's a lot of debate about, well, can you actually train someone to be an architect in 2 years or 3 years if you're doing a 300 degree point master's? So it's always sort of working through those different scales, and you know, there's the metrics that a university will have. I mean, at Melbourne University, we've got the Melbourne model, which means that we have a whole lot of other subjects that we're trying to teach, which means there are fewer subjects in architecture, and it's just like, oh my, yeah. So how do you deal with those types of challenges?
And it's so important to remember that architecture is, yes, a referential profession. We do look things up, but also a generalist profession, and we have to know so much from so many different areas and disciplines. We've just had a text come in from a
is that the Vice Chancellor saying, I don't have a job anymore for criticising the Melbourne model?
No, it's actually Joanne from Bond Beach. Thank you so much for texting, Joanne. Hi, Kirsten. As an educator, how do you balance teaching theoretical concepts with preparing students for practical challenges in the profession?
Without making them sad. That's a really, it's actually a really important question, particularly for professional practice, and because I have a lot of guest speakers who come in and talk to students, and so we've got a strange thing where we have a 2-hour seminar, so there'll be a core content part and then there'll be a guest lecture. Often when they come in, they're just like, oh, how do I talk about architecture without sort of, you know, talking about the things that need to be done, but without making it really sad. And it's not that easy, because on one hand, and it probably has a little bit to do with our training, particularly at the end of a project, you're constantly looking at all the things that need to be changed and fixed so that, you know, someone can have a really great experience in this space. And so as you're sort of crossing off all the defects, that's the only thing that you're looking at. And so often when we're teaching these, we're looking at the defects going, how do we fix these? But sometimes forget that, you know, it is this amazing thing. There's nothing better than having designed something, and then, you know, you're walking through that space later after you've forgotten about the defects list and just going, oh yeah,
wow,
this is actually not too bad.
So you get to bring, we are registered, we are licensed to bring something into existence that didn't exist before. That's a pretty amazing thing to do.
It is. It also has its challenges to it as well because, they're usually very expensive things and they're there for a long time. And so, this is where the disability work really comes to its fore because each decision that we make will have an impact. And so whether it's a particular material or just going, just make that stair just a little bit higher, all of those things have an impact. So, it's...
Everything is a design decision. I must be sounding like a broken record to the listeners now after 83, I think we're up to broadcasts, but everything is a design decision.
Absolutely.
The book covers some practical methods about empathy mapping and power mapping.
Yep.
Can you bring us into your world? What does that mean?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things I do in addition is I also teach, and before I joined Melbourne, I did a lot of applied design thinking subjects. And so it was really providing tools for people to, how you make decisions, but how you make informed decisions, but also how you explain to others how those decisions have been made so they're not just going, you just made that up. So the design thinking part, and particularly with looking at futures, so how can we look at, think of future scenarios without sort of imagining some type of crystal ball. And I've worked with some really great people. Bridget Engler, who is at Swinburne and she's in the Faculty of Business and Law, is a brilliant futurist and has just been so amazing to work with. And so a lot of those ideas about, okay, so how do I strategically look at futures and then be able to backcast from some future scenario to figure out, okay, so how do I start to move forward? So a little bit of that came into the book, but the lobby also has a number of worksheets and workshops that they run on power mapping. So if you're wanting to make effective change, it's also understanding who has the power to say yes and who has the power to sort of squash your idea. And so once you start to map out, who is it that you need to be talking to, then it's figuring out, okay, so how do I start to communicate or address my needs, the things that I want to change, so that it has impact and I'm not just sort of, talking in my own bubble according to my own algorithms. So, so those became very important, and so we thought that also brings out a lot of the core ideas of the architecture lobby and their manifestos and things like that.
And what is empathy mapping?
Empathy mapping is where you are thinking about how someone else might experience something. And I have a slight issue with it. It is important, but I also think co-design becomes a really valuable tool where you're actually working with someone and you're getting their insight. Empathy mapping gives you some empathy where you might imagine that you're in someone else's shoes, but you just have to be careful about how you get your information so you're not creating this sort of elastic persona that can sort of morph according to, should I really put these stairs here or should I, it makes it much easier if you've actually got a real person with real
lived experience.
Yeah.
And that's really becoming so valued now in public work.
Yep, absolutely.
And there's sort of user groups that get set up around the major public projects in particular. The book also covers case studies for some of these successful organising efforts. Are you able to share some of these stories with us?
Yeah, so, one of the things is we completely acknowledge that we're not the only ones who've had this idea and that there's been lots of people who've been doing this beforehand. One of the things the lobby's doing is we've got... we're going to be in the Venice Biennale, so we're all sort of going back to the mothership, which is actually a really interesting, and it was a really interesting conversation for the lobby, because one of their things as part of their manifesto is not doing free labour and that everybody should be reimbursed for the work that they do.
Was the Biennale free labour?
It's free labour.
Unbelievable.
So, but it's the Biennale. And so it's this really interesting conflict because it's like the Architecture Biennale is like all the little architects in their black clothes go to the mothership in Venice and sort of walk around.
Yeah, the swarm.
The swarm, yeah. So, I was interviewing Justine Clark from Parlour, who's one of our examples.
And a past guest on the program,
Yes.
listeners, so you can go back to replay
Yes.
her conversation.
Absolutely.
We had a lot of fun in the studio.
And so it was really interesting with that, and so the evolution of Parlour. So looking initially at issues around women in architecture, and now that's more about gender. And it's when I was interviewing Justine for the Venice project, we were having that conversation. She's like, no, but I'm not really an organizer. But then we were talking about the different projects. I'm like, but secretly you are, particularly with their new Parlour Annex, where they've got people who are talking about neurodiversity. And so there's frameworks that are being set up under that Parlour banner so that
absolutely.
it's, the people can sort of take their own things. And so it's not just Justine and that team.
So many sub-events.
Yeah.
And sub-branded events and the canons of thinking that are advocating and researching different issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And and so with a lot of the case studies, it was just sort of highlighting, here's a whole lot of people who've been doing some amazing stuff, and and go and have a look at how they did that, but also how they communicated that with people, and what the impact of that was. So it's it was for us. Those case studies became really important, but they did come in. It was interesting because we'd put the book together, and we're just sort of how do we start to talk about these things? And so then it was big discussions about structure. Lots of big discussions about structure,
and things that become systemic. We do give lots of shout outs to Parlour on this program, and particularly I've been privileged to have conversations with Parlour at their events about procurement. That's really becomes a systemic thing in our industry, and the absolute foundation, or one of the really core foundation blocks of where a success can come from or where a problem can come from. And the Office of the Victorian Government Architects even published this quite comprehensive but very straightforward document. Listeners, anyone can read it, anyone can download this. It's Government a Smart Client, to educate government on how to be a better client. I feel that you'd share my sentiments that procurement is incredibly important to help mitigate some of these other issues that we're facing in the profession, the immediate and some of these other upstream issues, and ones that maybe even seem removed from the profession, or a global issue like the gender pay gap, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. Procurement is a really interesting one because so I'm also an examiner with the Architects Registration Board, and so we still examine people on a very traditional model. We also have to acknowledge that very few of our candidates now have that traditional model experience, because most of our contracts are novated. Victoria loves novated contracts, or design and construct, or partial services. And so initially when we first started, it was just people who worked in really large practices. But we would always have some really good conversations about alliancing, where you have teams of people who then work together. And all of those have a particular place in it. And, the building industry is becoming more complex. The buildings are becoming more complex. The city's more complex. We have global supply chains that we need to navigate. We also have the roles and responsibilities of different consultants, and who sort of is trying to stay in each other's, or stay in our own lane without sort of getting into other people's lanes. But then, there's other things where we have, project management, which then, not that I'm dissing project managers, but when you start to sort of compartmentalise things, and there are tier 1 and tier 2 builders who do this all really well, but then there are others who are not in that range. And it's, if you've got the window person who does their stuff, and then you've got the concrete person who does stuff, but the connection between those, like, accidentally leaving out waterproofing, becomes an issue. And so the contract in itself sort of just creates space where these things can happen.
Some are saying that we should be lobbying the financial sector and the financial industries to stop funding non-architect administered contracts.
Yes. And I agree with that. But I would also say that there are a number of architects who are quite happy not doing that. And so the question is, should there be sort of a different category, which is just the designer? And should you, if you're an architect and your role is to organise and oversee documentation and to be able to take a design idea from your design and then take it through to the built form, that there's a whole lot of responsibilities that you need to be able to manage and organise. And so it's an interesting one where there's tensions about, should we deprofessionalise? Should we protect the title architect? I mean, if I was going to have surgery, and I'd want someone who's a qualified surgeon, sort of, particularly if they're going to operate on my brain or something. I want someone with experience and.
But we're not exaggerating right now. Buildings are just as dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the responsibility is just as serious.
Well, even when we look at the Shergold Weir report, and we have, the Opal Towers, where, people, Christmas Eve, they're there and they're, getting ready to sort of kick into the holidays, and you hear great big cracking, and then you're out of your apartment for months. So it's absolutely serious, and it's I think that there's others who are just like, I'm happy. I don't know whether it's like the cult of the design studio, and this takes me back to many arguments that we had about the book, because there's few of us teach professional practice, others don't, and so there's a bit of turf territory about that. But it is really it's a really important set of distinctions to make, and unfortunately, architects also carry liability insurance, and not everybody in the construction industry does. And so, if stuff goes wrong, we're on target. So
it sticks to us and slides off others.
Oh yeah.
Well, what do you think the biggest barrier or the hurdle, rather, that we need to get over, and really believe we must find a way to get over in the construction industry that is hamstringing quality and confidence in quality?
It was interesting. A few years ago, Peter Razbash and I organised with the Association of Consulting Architects a number of public forums. And the first one was on confidence in the construction industry. And so we had a whole lot of people, we had a panel of people from builders, from the VBA, architects, and landscape was the next one. And architects, and having a conversation about what the main concerns were. And it was great because when you need Ted Ballieu to do a drop mic moment at the end, he was fabulous. And so, but it just sort of started a series of conversations. The next one we had was looking at procurement in particular, and we chose not to have. We had an architect moderate that. But it was everybody, like landscape, building surveyors, insurers, and they all have the same issue. And from that, we then had smaller conversations, one with Tier 1 and Tier 2 builders, and also with sort of the 10 large architectural practices in Melbourne. For that one, it was very much about, let's talk about our value. For the second one with the builders, it was a concern about documentation, but it was also making sure that that architects weren't excluded from the conversation, but that we're part of that conversation in a way where we're contributing positively to that. I think I'm not really answering your question, but I've sort of deviated into sort of a time memory thing. So
I think it's really important to know and comforting to know that there are many people that are seriously looking into these issues and questions. Listeners will forgive me because I'm about to ask an extremely nerdy question that has been burning in me for quite a while, and I don't often get answered. So far no one's been able to tell me why not.
Is it my favourite citation system?
No, not the citation system. We'll completely leave that one out perhaps. But I do really, really want to ask, from your perspective and all your knowledge about procurement and the systems and structures that are in place here across the scales that you've researched and that you're so heavily involved in organisations, what's stopping us as an industry and us as a society and us as clients and partners, what's stopping us from using alliance contracts or Australian-style alliancing on projects that are smaller, from the value of, say, 5 million to 15 million or 5 to 25 million. These projects that small and medium-sized practices are dealing with, projects that are whose fees are heavily affected, projects whose staff involved. There's a lot of human labour goes into these projects. Projects like this sporting pavilion that we're broadcasting out of tonight, that the radio station is in. Projects that the local government is a big client of, and small state government organisations are big clients of. And actually, as we know, the government is one of the largest client and largest customer and procurer of architecture in Australia and architectural services. So my super nerdy question is what's stopping us from actually using alliance contracting and being that non-adversarial environment? Also, listeners must forgive me again. Alliance contracting basically means you're in a team and you're not fighting, and your wins are shared, and there's a lot of incentive to be successful together.
Yeah. I think there just needs to be some really good case studies of how that's worked at a smaller scale. I think it's a really good idea, but it also is a challenge to traditional business structures. And I was having a conversation with someone about this, and I'm just trying to figure out where it was. But whether, there's more sort of free agency about, you've got teams of people who can sort of be able to move across different practices. So I guess it's probably a rethinking of how we think about the business of architecture and think about the possibilities of and also the intricacies. I mean, there's also, all the insurances and registrations and things that we have to carry. But, how that works in a more sort of fluid environment. So I think it can happen. It's just making sure that there are, probably when we were looking at case studies of things that were successful, to then say, there's lots of ways of doing that. And I think particularly with, this year being a little bit more of a difficult year for architects, that there probably needs to be some more creative ways about how we think about business. And, and if we're not seeing architecture as a business, well then, then it's just an art, and then, we start to lose our value. But I think that would be a great thing. But it's just, how we manage that and provide some really good case studies, so that then, government can say, actually, that's a really good idea, we'll implement that. Because if we've got really good evidence to say, yes, this works, then, we keep going.
It's just scaling those case studies down right from the LXRA, from the major infrastructure, from the National Museum of Australia, Hamer Hall refurbishment, going from these multi-million-dollar projects of, three numbers at the front instead of, hundreds of millions.
So have you thought about doing a PhD?
This is how they get you listeners. they come into the program and try and entice you. But we have regular lines of inquiry about procurement, because there's my two personal hills to die on: procurement and intention, and how important it is to get that right in a project. And then everything else can be resolved, right, through some strategic thinking, some creative thinking, the design thinking that we're trained in.
Yep, absolutely. One of the best things when I moved from Swinburne to Melbourne is that the room that I'm in, I've got a couple of people who are sort of halfway between architecture and construction management, and then a whole lot of construction management people. And it's really great having, apart from sort of conversations about coffee, and Paolo always has chocolate, which is great, but having those conversations about, how do we change things and how we rethink ideas. Today we were talking about a grant that we're preparing, and we're looking at, we've got some measuring tools that are usually used for infrastructure, and so we want to measure the ageing of buildings, so that before there's a conversation about whether we should pull something down or not, we can know whether that building has aged gracefully, or whether it's had a wild youth and its time's up. And as we were talking about that and talking about demolition, then there's a whole lot of other things that sort of come into that conversation. And so it's weird sort of thinking, I had a really good conversation about asbestos and demolition today, but also thinking about, well, how do we then design buildings for demolition? And so it's having that sort of interdisciplinary space has just been one of the best things, because it's not just, my bubble talking to other architects. It's, how do we, and also there's, challenges to each other as well.
I'm almost having a similar thought this week, where it's a recurring idea in my mind. If only these clients had known to just come and speak to an architect first.
Yeah.
Even if your project doesn't progress, you can still get some pointers and some directions on where to go. Come and chat to your local friendly architect first.
Oh, when I was at Swinburne, I was the course director for interior, and the thing I hated most was the block, because everyone would just go, I can do that for,
I can do it myself, and I can do it overnight.
And it'll be really cheap, and I can just do it all at the, buying stuff from wherever, and then it all goes wrong. But there's, in the background, it's not sort of, there's not the builders in the background and the designers in the background who are giving advice, and
the ones fixing it afterwards too.
Yeah, it's and how do you argue against people who are just like, but I can do that for cheaper.
I just quote our mutual favourite researcher, Dr Peter Razbash, who's getting a lot of shout outs tonight.
Yeah.
And his work with Archi Team, that for every dollar you spend on architect's fees, it's $11.30 back.
Yeah, well, we shouldn't shout him out too much. He's in Italy at the moment, having a great time.
Very lucky, Peter.
Yes.
Well, let's return back to Melbourne and to the teachings and to the students, where we're headed as a profession, and what this next generation of students is going to bring for us.
I really hope that the next generation can start to explore some of those ideas about alternative ways of practice, that we have more conversations about that. We do think about architecture as a business, and that we think about it as a serious practice. I mean, the design part is, great. But when you're in business, it's only a very small percentage. But being a really good designer is also important.
Yes.
And, understanding regulations and guidelines and things like that. But I think the most important thing for that is understanding why. Because it's one thing to sort of read it and just go, I have to comply with that rubbish. But then if you're thinking about it, it's like, well, got a mate in a wheelchair who's, just dealing with, trying to keep their chair stable, or someone who's, trying to navigate their way through a hospital reception area, and, they're stressed because, their partner's in there doing whatever, and it's, you can't see where the reception is, or, it's a very confusing environment, or you've got people who, can't read signs, or it's, there's glare or other things. So it's really sort of thinking about how the user will use that space, and not just, why have I got to comply with this? These, the disability design guides. So it's, I guess it's, it's important that we understand that, and ultimately, it's important because it's a legal responsibility of ours to be able to do that. And it's sad to sort of just go, oh, you have to do it because it's legal. But there's, if you can design something that is just a really beautiful space to be in, that everyone can enjoy, they don't feel excluded or segregated because they can't enter that space, or that space really bothers them because it's creating an atmosphere that is triggering in a way. It's beyond our ego, I guess.
I see all these challenges as just design opportunities.
Yeah.
That it has to push you to be the best architect possible. And after spending a couple of years in major public health projects, you certainly learn how to design and how to find design in the most difficult and the most clinical of constraints.
Oh, absolutely. And also how all the different people who are using that space. So, there's the patient, but then there's also the medical staff. There's the people who clean that space. There's the visitors. Even just thinking about the ceiling, it just, rather than it just being, the ceiling tiles that all sort of seem to not line up because they've been put in over, decades. But that's what a patient's seeing.
I have another future focused question. There's been so much conversation this week about AI. There's been a scandal this week already about AI. And I often like to ask guests where they think it's going, and commonly people come back to me and say it's just a tool. And an idea that I'm really sitting with and enjoying at the moment is saying, okay, well, it just means that we're going to have to make the challenge academically even harder. Just like when calculators came in, with that next level of expectation will rise.
Yeah. I think it's inevitable, and I mean it's already almost inescapable. I was doing some grant stuff the other week, and we were talking about an option came up with Microsoft Word, and it said, would you like to participate? And I'm just going, no. But I use AI all the time. I use ChatGPT all the time. I use Grammarly, all kinds of things. I use it probably as a tool for mainly sort of copy editing, and often I'll dictate stuff and then just rewrite this so it actually makes sense. And it's like, oh, it makes sense. And so it's just saved myself 15 minutes on an email. But yeah, I think it's when it's taking it that next step. I did a review for a book that was on Glenn Murcutt's work, and it was really beautiful. It was like the most beautiful book. I think Thames and Hudson. And like opening the book is like opening this sort of amazing sort of Issey Miyake type of perfume box. And it's all Glenn's work, and it's beautiful and it's very Glenn. But what they had done is it was unbuilt work, and they had it wouldn't have been an AI, but it was very similar to looking at a lot of those AI renderings. And it was all like the buildings were like Zempic buildings. They were all just a little bit skinny. The engineering wasn't quite there. There were no downpipes. There was the same bowl of fruit that was in every sort of third render. But it was an interesting one because it was still Glenn's work, and you could see the signature in that. But it was there was something about it. It was still incredibly beautiful and to look at, and it was really interesting to sort of see these pieces of work. But there was just something about that. There was something off, and I think with AI, because you don't have the constraints of gravity, cost, budget, there aren't those, which I also see as design challenges. It wasn't, there was just something about it. It'll probably change as AI becomes more sophisticated. But I think until AI can take legal responsibility, we've got a bit of breathing space. But there's just, I don't know, because you could also argue that, a person who might have, because we talk about AI hallucinations, but you also might have someone who might miss something. And so what is the difference between AI and sort of the human mind? But I I don't know. It's... Ugh.
I'm mindful of the time, so I'll ask my last question.
Yes.
And that's what gives you hope.
I think this is why I teach, because it is that next generation, and hoping that the decisions that they make and the things that they learn, which is very different to what I did in the 80s and 90s, that, you know, the city will be a better place and that it will be more accessible and more beautiful, and that we still have our public parks and we still have our greenery and we still have spaces where we can, you know, have public transport and things that give a quality of life to our cities. And so it is that, that our cities remain sort of spaces for people.
Hear, hear. Thank you so much for joining me on the program,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Kirsten Day.
Thanks for joining me for another evening of radio architecture with Ilana Razbash. This live show was broadcast and recorded in the Radio Karim studio on Bunurong Country. You can replay the show wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for tuning in and supporting community radio. Take care.
It's Henry Wagons here, and you must not switch the dial from Radio Karim. You're about to hear something that will change your life forever.